Hello. Hey, everyone. So today we are on the Sound Off Ladies. It looks a little bit different. It's not our usual 4 ladies and our guest that we have on board. What you're seeing today is myself, Alexis, Marley, and we have an interpreter with us today. Her name is Carrie. And we have a very special guest with us. Her name is Judy Heumann. Yay. And I can't be more excited about having Judy here with us today. It is a special month as well. We have the American for Disabilities Act, their 30th anniversary, but even more than that, we have a lot of special stories and comments that we want to share with you guys through Judy's eyes and through her experience as the world's most recognized disability rights activist. So thank you, Judy, for joining us today. I can't be more grateful.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So I would like to start off by sharing some of your work, which we'll get into, and how your work has impacted my life as a deaf person. So when I was in preschool, kindergarten, I had attended a school for the deaf in New York, and I attended there until I was in kindergarten. The school had made some recommendations that I should be placed closer to a school that was close to my house, and I was the only deaf individual. I was what you would call a single mainstream student for most of my life, or the sole deaf student in the classroom. My parents, gratefully, I had a lot of support at home, but the school wasn't providing a lot of services until high school.
Are your parents deaf?
Yes. Yes. And so until high school, which was 1981, my parents learned about this law that does require deaf students to have access and education. And you know who was responsible for that law? Judy!
I was part of a team. I was only one of the team.
So I was able to get an interpreter for the first time in my life, and that didn't happen until high school, which was a game changer. It changed my life. And through that experience, I decided to go through an education in law school. So by the time I got into law school in 1990, the ADA law was passed and, well, was signed into law. By the time that I graduated from law school, ADA became effective. 1992. So you have had a huge impact on my whole life, my career, my experience as a deaf individual. Thank you, Judy. Thank you.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. My path, like your paths, we kind of didn't know what was going to be happening when we were kids. And I went to a camp called Camp Gennad. There's a film out right now called Crip, C-R-I-P, Camp, and it highlights activities that were going on in 1971. It's on Netflix, so people should watch it. But earlier than that year, there had been a couple of deaf teenagers who were in my bunk. And I'd never met anyone who was deaf. And I'm sure they hadn't met any people who had physical disabilities. And I have no idea why they went to the camp, but they were there for a couple of summers. And that's really when I started getting exposed to sign language and the deaf community. And I remember there was a speech therapist at this camp who came over to me and said, you shouldn't be using sign language. You should only be, using your voice, because, the girls need to learn how to read lips. And I thought, this is so crazy. It made no sense to me. And so they were teaching me sign language. I never got into oralism, but I worked in the Senate for about a year and a half. And there were two laws that were being advanced at that point. One was Section 504, which was a very important piece of legislation in the 70s and still today, which required that children who had disabilities were to be able to go to the regular schools and get supports. But then in 1975, what was then called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act was passed. Now it's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so, it's very disturbing, Alexis, that it was not till like 1980 or 81 that you had access to an interpreter, because that's an indication of problems that still go on today, where there are laws on the books that are not appropriately being implemented. Because you should have had access to an interpreter because your schools were covered under Section 504. So I think it's a great example, and also speaks to the problem that happens today to too many people, in spite of laws that we have, that their families don't know about their rights, or school systems make it difficult to really get the services that kids are legitimately eligible for.
Right. Marley says you're right. And I'm so glad that you brought this up, Judy. It's important education for deaf and hard of hearing children. And I also just want to back up a little bit and give you a quick summary about me and what we were just talking about, and then we'll dive into a little bit more. I was born and raised in Chicago, and I became deaf when I was 18 months old, and that was in the 1960s, and my parents were a little bit shocked. They weren't sure what to do with a deaf child. They had never seen a deaf child ever before. My parents were, and there were no resources. There were no resources out there at that time. There were no instructions of how to raise me, or which type of language I should use, or what type of school I would go to, or what the future would look like for me. And I had older brothers, and they thought, oh, the hearing brothers, my brothers could take care of themselves. They were older. But now that I was their child and I was deaf, and of course, all the only people that they were meeting were people who were specialized doctors in deafness. And so they would talk about, how is Marley going to have access to language? How do we raise her? And the doctors had said there was only one solution at the time. And my parents thought, what is it? And the doctor said, we have to send her to a deaf school. My parents thought, oh, all right, it's the only option. So my parents looked all over the Midwest. All the schools were fine. They were impressed. They saw some great schools for learning. But one of the things that stuck with them for a long time, that really bothered them, was who was going to be putting Marley to bed, and who was going to tell her that they love her every night. And so they told the doctor. They went back to the doctor. They said, how? Who's going to do that? And of course, the doctor didn't have an answer. And so then my parents, they were like, all right. They did their homework. They did more research. They started talking with more people, other people who had deaf kids, teachers who were teaching deaf kids all over, whether they were teaching oralism or sign language. And I started at an oral school at first, and my parents saw that I was really having a hard time. I spoke pretty well, but they felt like it wasn't going to be enough for me. So my parents really pushed and really took an extra step, and they exposed me to sign language, but not until I was 5. And it was taught by Sam Bylock. And he was a deaf man who did a lot for the deaf community at the time. And my life changed. being able to start sign language when I was 5, my whole life changed for the better. And that gave a lot of relief to my parents, but they didn't stop there. They brought me to a mainstream school, and that mainstream school had a deaf education program. And my parents saw that there was signing involved with the mainstream program, so that also gave them some relief. And then during that time, while I was growing up, I was taking some speech classes, which turned out I loved. And it's different for a deaf child to love speech classes, but I love talking, obviously. And speech, oralism, learning how to talk. And then, of course, my parents were always supportive of me. Barriers, that word was not in their vocabulary, but breaking barriers was in their vocabulary, which I'm sure is how your parents were with you. And I was sent over to a synagogue for the deaf. There was a temple there. I went through my bar mitzvah, and they took me to summer camp, where at the summer camp there was deaf kids and hearing kids, and that had introduced me into acting, and everybody there was so encouraging. And I didn't stop there. I mean, everyone let me be myself. Everybody let me play with my neighbors, and I mean, just like you did with your neighbors. And I with the book that you wrote, I was able to identify with a lot of things that you mentioned. I really felt the same as you did. And so being in mainstream classes while I was in high school, that wasn't working out for me. I really wasn't able to engage with teachers that were able to sign. I felt like the teachers weren't using my language. It didn't feel like my culture. The interpreters, I was having a really hard time with them. And so I felt more comfortable in the deaf education classes where it was deaf students with teachers that were signing. That was my comfort zone. And Alexis is saying that was the complete opposite for me. Alexis was saying, I was happy. I was happy in a completely opposite classroom situation than you were. And Marley is saying, I want to bring it back to Crip Camp for you. I saw that movie. It was fascinating. It was interesting to see everybody that was disabled, all the different disabilities. There was no judgment. There was no, you're different than I am. There was none of that. Everybody felt the same. Everybody was at ease with everybody. And that's how I felt at the deaf school whenever I was in the deaf program as well. And so I'm curious, I'm just wondering, how did your parents find out about Crip Camp?
So the name of the camp was Camp Gennad, J-E-N-E-D. For the film, they called it Crip Camp. Yeah, Gennad. So, there were a number of camps in New York State for kids with disabilities. And actually, I had gone to another camp before I went to Camp Gennad called Camp Oakhurst in New Jersey, which was run by the Jewish Federation. I think it still is run by the Jewish Federation. And some of my friends were going to Camp Gennad. And so I started going to camp when I was like 9, and I went to Camp Oakhurst for a couple of years and then went to Gennad. And in part because the regular camps, like my brothers went to camp. They went to a camp called Wilmot, and it was not wheelchair accessible. So the reason I went to a camp for disabled kids is none of the other camps were accessible. And in many ways, it was a great experience because, for me, the value of camp was the fact that we went for weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and it was a great opportunity, to be away from our family. And I think also, when I was a teenager, which is when I started to go to Camp Gennad, it was a real opportunity for me to be speaking with other disabled teenagers about a lot of our concerns. Because I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the deaf community, you did have examples of adults who were deaf who were in professional positions. they were teachers, or they were principals, or they were running organizations like the National Association of the Deaf and other types of jobs. In the area of physical disability, except for President Roosevelt, there really weren't a lot of role models of people who were deaf. And so, you know, one of the things about going to Camp for Disabled Kids is it really allowed us to talk about our lives and what we wanted for our futures, but also we're able to talk about, in the case of people with physical disabilities, things like buses that weren't accessible, trains that weren't accessible, streets that didn't have ramps on them, movie theaters that weren't accessible, on and on. And that's really when we started thinking about, well, what could we do to make the society more accessible for us? And we also were saying, well, you know, this is not just for us, but many of the things that we needed made things more accessible for everybody. And so my parents didn't send me this camp because they thought I was going to be becoming a disability activist, but it definitely was something that came out of my being with disabled people and our thinking about, well, there are things that we can do to make society become accessible to us. And I think also for me, since I was young, I always looked at doing work across disability. So, you know, people with different types of disabilities, physical disabilities, blindness, low vision, deafness, hard of hearing, you know, mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, on and on. That was something that I always felt was really valuable, was to work together. So, and I think my parents pretty early on saw that as something that was also important.
Yes. And Alexis has a question for you. What do you think would have happened if you didn't attend that camp?
It's an interesting question. I would say that I may well have continued to do some of the work that I did eventually do, but I think I would not have had the same level of comfort in being able to feel that I could speak up and out about areas of discrimination and changes that we felt needed to happen, because I would have been in a much more limited way with disabled people. Now, you know, the other thing was I didn't go to school until I was 9 years old, because the school in my neighborhood wasn't wheelchair accessible, and they wouldn't let me go to that school because they said I was a fire hazard. And so a teacher came to my house. I didn't go to kindergarten at all. And then for the first, second, third, and half of the fourth grade, a teacher came to my house for literally 2.5 hours a week. Then when I started going to school, the classrooms were in a regular school building, but I was in segregated classes, only disabled kids. The teaching wasn't very good. And so if I hadn't gone to camp, I would have continued to be in those classes till I went to high school. And even there, my homeroom was just disabled kids. And so I think really being at camp gave me weeks at a time to be able to really hone my advocacy skills. So I think if I hadn't had that opportunity, things would have been different, but not totally different.
Marley's saying, you know, you led the first ever disability protest. I mean, we're talking about activism. And so fast forward, we have so many questions, but fast forward in so little time. I mean, being a female activist, you were leading the protest. What were some of your challenges? I mean, especially with this being done, you had no historical references. So what were your challenges? How did you do that? I mean, and also you were a female, so was it more challenging?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in the deaf community in the 70s, just like in the physical disability in the 70s, the women were doing the work and significantly the men were getting the credit. But we had started this organization. We had started this organization in New York called Disabled in Action. And actually, when we set it up and had our first board of directors, we made sure to have 2 men on the board, but everybody else was a disabled woman. So that was really very important because we were the leadership. But we were learning from what other political movements were doing. So there'd been some demonstrations that were led by disabled people, but by and large, I think one of the bigger ones was in 1936. So what we were doing in the 1970s was really very different. And I'm speaking for myself, having been watching what was going on in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, in the Great Panthers of the senior movement, we were looking at what people were doing that was enabling the general public to learn more about their stories and the situations that were going on. So that was something that we were definitely trying to do. We were mimicking what other groups had done. But of course, because we were disabled people, we didn't have very much influence. And, but we were and I would say that camp was very important because it really gave us opportunities to think more strategically. And that really did help us as we were beginning to launch more activities in the community.
Camp was like a seed.
Yes.
And it grew.
Yes.
Alexis has another question. So you were a female, you were leading an organization, but you still were putting yourself in the streets of New York City. And not many people would do that. I mean, even today, people wouldn't do that. So what was going through your mind? I mean, you were a female leader, and I mean, you had a very serious movement that you were a part of. So I'm just curious, what was going through your mind? What were you feeling? You were on Madison Avenue in New York City.
That's a funny story. So how we got to Madison Avenue. I'm squirming because I got a new wheelchair seat and it's not exactly right. So that's why I'm moving around a lot. And your audience can know that. Really, I think we were all very influenced by what had been going on within the civil rights movement and how people on a regular basis were really putting their lives on the line to be able to end segregation. And a lot of what we were working on was really getting the general public to understand the plight of disabled people in the United States. And the demonstrations in New York were because we wanted people to understand why this particular law, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, why this law was important to us. And because it had been vetoed by Nixon. So, but how we got to Madison Avenue is the funny part. So let me quickly say, we organized a demonstration, a group called Disabled in Action in Brooklyn, and a group in Queens called Pride. And we went to a federal building in Manhattan. And it probably was the only building in the entire city of New York, and I don't think I'm really exaggerating, where there was no traffic. It was this building on this little square block, and we went there and we had built a coffin saying, you know, the lives of disabled people were being destroyed. We had great flyers, but nobody was there. We went and sat in the street, but honestly, it didn't matter because there were hardly any cars. And the police were there. And this police officer said to me, "What do you want? Where do you want to go?" And I thought, where is Nixon headquarters? And the guy calls in to his headquarters and says, "Where is Nixon headquarters?" Because remember, there were no smartphones then. So he couldn't just look it up. And they told us. I swear, it's true. So we all got from where we were in the city to Madison Avenue. Nothing was planned. And there we were, we thought, well, if we sit on the sidewalk, nobody's gonna look at us at all. So we're gonna sit in the street. And when we first sat in the street, we made like a circle. That was too terrifying. Because, you know, Madison Avenue, there were these huge trucks and everything. So we backed up, but we did stop one street, which pretty much shut the city down. And we gave out so many flyers. But it was very important because we really, while we didn't get very much coverage that day, we had another demonstration 4 days later, where we had a group of disabled people, including some disabled veterans, and we marched against traffic going up Times Square and went back to Nixon headquarters. So I think it was both exciting for those of us who were working on these issues to be able to see that we publicly could go out and say to people, these are the barriers that we're facing. These are the things that need to be addressed. We want to be integrated in the community just like you. And we want you to understand, you know, what your role is and what our role is and what the role of the law was.
That all led to April of 1977 in San Francisco at the Federal Building. All of that led to you guys going to the San Francisco Federal Building, which I am sure Alexis would, you know, back me up. That building should be named the Judy Heumann Federal Building. That's what we think. It should be named after you. So you sat there for 28 days, or there was a sit-in for 28 days.
With 150 people and a good group of deaf people.
Right. And so what had stopped anybody from pulling you folks out of that building? What was based in that building? How did they not get you out of there? You had a variety of disabled people there. You had people in wheelchair, people in crutches, you had deaf people there. Everything was going on for 28 days, and you guys just hung out there and people from outside didn't come and take you out? What was your plan? I mean, how did they not drag you out of there?
So, the Bay Area, I moved from,
What did you guys plan in there? What did you talk about? What did you do?
so I had moved from Brooklyn to Berkeley because I went to graduate school. And a number of my friends from New York moved there. And we were working at the Center for Independent Living, which is the first Center for Independent Living in the United States. And people don't live there. It's a non-residential advocacy organization doing public policy and advocacy. And we had been working as a cross-disability organization. We actually started working with deaf people when a guy named Dale Dahl, who unfortunately died, he was born deaf, and then he was hit by a car when he was an adult. And so he was a wheelchair user. And he was what's called a triplegic. So he couldn't use fingers on one hand, and he could use his fingers pretty good on the other hand. And so the organization that he used to go to a lot was not wheelchair accessible. And he had come over to CIL because he needed, services and supports that the center was giving. And I knew a little bit of sign language, and really not a lot of people knew any sign language. But he was very influential in, really expanding the work that we were doing. And that's how we got involved in deaf services. And because he knew so many deaf people, he was the one that, as we were working on the demonstrations in April of '77, he also reached out to quite a number of other deaf people who didn't have physical disabilities. And they also started coming and hanging out at CIL because we started a job development, job placement program. And we had a guy named Joe Quinn. I don't know if either of you know Joe Quinn. Yeah, so Joe, is, amongst other things, a sign language interpreter. But so Joe was involved with us as we were setting up the demonstrations, and a woman named Lynette Taylor that I know both of you know. Lynette Taylor happened to be in San Francisco. She had just moved there, literally a week or so earlier. So what happened was there's a group called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. That was created in 1975. And Al Pimentel and Terry O'Rourke and Fred Schreiber were active, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Were very active. They were in leadership positions on the board of directors. And there were blind people and physically disabled people and a mixture of everybody. And we came together in '75. One of the reasons was to work on getting the 504 regulations signed as they were. And I was living in Berkeley, as I said. I was on the board of ACCD, and we started organizing in the Bay Area, and we had a great coalition. And we really had not planned to stay overnight in the building, although myself and a couple of people had started quietly talking about, well, maybe we will need to stay in the building because we don't know what's going to happen.
And I'm going to stop you right there. You did pack extra clothing, right? Extra pieces of clothing just in case, right?
I took a pair of underpants and a toothbrush.
Okay, there we go.
And a couple of others did too.
Deep down.
So
Or you just had a feeling, right? That you were going to stay, that you weren't going to go back home that same night. You were going to go in that building and stay. You knew.
I think I wanted to be prepared. And what really happened was there were a lot of people who went to the demonstration and who came into the building. So the HEW building then was the Federal Department of Health for Region 9 and Education and Welfare. And we went onto the 4th floor. So when we, had a demonstration that lasted for 27, 28 days, it was on the 4th floor. And it basically meant that we had taken over offices and different parts. People had gone and worked in other parts of the building. But the reason we stayed overnight was it was called the regional director. He didn't know anything about the 504 regs. We were there to talk about what's happening, when are they going to be signed, what changes are they looking at making. And the man had not been briefed, and his staff didn't know anything. And I think, those of us who were leading the demonstration, said we can't leave because they don't know what we're talking about. They're not taking us seriously. And that's ultimately why we stayed in San Francisco. And, there was a demonstration in Washington, D.C. that Fred and Terry and others were at. And the reason they stayed only one night is because they wouldn't let them have any food or medicine. Alexis, you were asking about how come we were allowed to stay there. I think there were many things that were going on. We had a much more active disability community in the Bay Area. Mayor Moscone agreed. He was the mayor of San Francisco. He agreed with what we were doing, what we were fighting for. And Jerry Brown, who was the governor at that time, there was a man named Ed Roberts who worked in Sacramento. He was the director of the Department of Rehabilitation, and we were all friends, and he knew what was happening, and he supported our being there. Actually, it was the head of the Department of Health that sent mattresses down so that we had things that we could sleep on. So it was unlike DC.
And the Black Panthers brought food, right?
So what's important about, people should look at the Netflix film. What was very important was that in the Bay Area, we had been doing a lot of work with other civil rights organizations, not just on disability. And so, yes.
With a lot of people.
Yes. And so they had supported what we were doing. One of the people who was involved in organizing the demonstrations was a man named Brad Lomax, and he was a member of the Black Panthers, and he also had multiple sclerosis. And so they were supporting the work that he was doing, and he stayed in the building with us also. And when we went into the building, that's when the Panthers were asked and agreed to supply food. So that was very helpful. And for people from the Bay Area, there were quite a number of other organizations that were known in the Bay Area, including Safeway and Glide Memorial Church and many, and the Farm Workers Union and National Organization for Women and many others that were supporting our activities.
Yeah. You had a lot of collaboration, a lot of support in order to make that happen. We saw in the movie, Crip Camp, that you left at some point to go to DC, where you had sat before, was it the congressional hearing with Congressman?
Yeah, so what happened was,
Burton and Miller, right?
yeah, that actually took place in San Francisco.
I mean, wow.
In the HEW building. So Congressman Burton.
It happened in that. didn't
Right.
realize. And wow. And talk about a very powerful piece in the film that showed how you told them, listen up.
Right.
And Marley saying she loves that part. When you say, stop nodding, you don't understand. And Alexis saying, and we use that phrase all the time today, stop nodding. You're nodding like you understand, but you don't. And so what was happening in those hearings? How were you able to get their full support? Because it seems like it was all from your guys' efforts.
So remember, the Bay Area congressional delegation was and is a very progressive delegation. And we had been working, the disability community, had been working with them. So what had happened was George Miller, who was a congressman at that point, had worked previously for Congressman Burton. And then he ran for Congress himself in a place called Contra Costa. And George had come up the Sunday before the hearings to the building just to check in and see how we were, because there was a woman named Ann Rosewater who worked for him, and she was out helping us and visiting us during the demonstrations. And when he arrived, myself and a few other people were on the telephone with a man named Peter, who was the legal counsel for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And we were reviewing the changes that they were discussing. And when George came, we asked him very quietly to pick up the phone so that Peter didn't know he was on the phone, but George was listening. And towards the end of the conversation, George started speaking to Peter, and he was very upset about what the department was proposing as far as changes for the draft 504 regs. And George said to everybody, you shouldn't leave the building until the regulations are signed. So that's really was another impetus to stay. You had asked earlier, Alexis, what were people doing while in the building? And that is a very good question, because there were about 150 people. And, it's kind of a little bit like now what's going on with COVID-19. People couldn't go out, and if they went out, they couldn't get back in. And we had all kinds of committees, a media committee that was reviewing what was on television, what was in the newspapers. They were working on press releases. We had a recreation committee, a food committee, all kinds of things to keep people engaged. And about 22 of us went to Washington. We were able to get donations, and we left and went to Washington to meet up with people from the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities and other disabled people who came from different parts of primarily the Northeast, but some others from California too. And when we were there, we were going and having many different meetings. So we met with US Senator Cranston, at that time was the senior senator for California. We had meetings over at the White House. We had demonstrations outside of President Carter's church. We went to the home of the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare 2 or 3 different times to have demonstrations outside his home. So,
how many days in that period of time from when, excuse me, you went to Washington, D.C., and then you were protesting there?
I should know the answer to that. I think we were there I was there about 2 weeks. And I think some of the other people were there. The regulations were signed on Thursday, and people left on Friday. to go back to San Francisco. And then everybody left the building in San Francisco that Saturday. I didn't go back because I had some meetings in Washington, so I actually stayed longer. But it was a very important, exciting time. And I think, when we look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came about 13 years later, you can see that the efforts that were undertaken to get the 504 law passed, the regulations developed and signed, was very much a lead into the work that needed to be done for the ADA.
And what was your involvement with the ADA? I know that we only have a few minutes left, and so I just want to wrap up. I do want to start to wrap up with what your involvement was with ADA. What kind of big work do you think we also is left for us to do with the ADA? And then if you could do this differently, what would you do differently? And whatever you want to wrap up with.
So I would say that I was involved with the work on the ADA. I worked with Justin Dart and Lex Frieden and a number of the senators and House members. I lived in California, but I went back and forth to Washington to meet with members. I testified in the hearings. The core group of people that were doing the day-to-day negotiating were pretty much in Washington at some point, like basically nonstop. And what was very important about the work that went on over those 8 years was expanding the knowledge of disabled individuals across the United States to get them to tell their stories about discrimination that were occurring in the public and private sector. The National Council on Disability played a pivotal role with Lex Frieden as the chair, as the executive director, and Justin Dart on the council, who really has been known as the father of the ADA, and working with the congressional members, with disabled people from their districts, really learning about, on a personal level, what the problems were and what the law would, how the law would make a difference. So, when I look at the work that went on over that 8-year period, there were many times when we didn't know whether or not we were going to be able to get the ADA through, and whether or not we would be able to make it as strong as it is right now. And it really was because of the leadership of people like Justin and Lex, and a woman named Pat Wright, and Arlene Mayerson, and others, Marilyn Golden, and others, Adapt, Bob Kafka, many others, who we all really worked together. The National Council on Independent Living, Marka Bristow from Chicago. It was really, Gallaudet, that's when the Deaf President Now movement came about in the mid-'80s. So it was a real visible coalition representing everybody. And that was very powerful. How would I do it differently? What I would still like today is that those of us who have disabilities really were more out about our disabilities, that we didn't feel ashamed of who we are, and that we could really more with a sense of respect for ourselves and pride, be able to say discrimination against one is discrimination against all. And many disabled people now are still struggling with how to come forward and talk about themselves as disabled people, but it's improving. And I think, ultimately, we've seen, very dramatic changes in all of our communities, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. And, you know, captioning and sign language interpreters and ramps and buses that are accessible and, you know, on and on. I think 30 years later, we have seen the value of ADA. I think we'd all agree, though, that society has not changed the way we want it to change. We're still not seen as people who are meaningful contributors of society, to society, by many people. And I think that's really one of the critical issues we're needing to address. We have a very high unemployment rate for disabled individuals. And now with COVID, I think we're going to have to really be very on top of what's going on with budgeting, with the way the world of work is going to change, how we have to make sure that disabled individuals are not cut out of the new jobs that are going to be moving forward. We're moving into a world that none of us anticipated. But, you know, for both of you and your listeners or readers, viewers, we have to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to be pushed back.
Right, right. And I think, like, you know, Marley definitely is testifying for captioning and closed captioning, and a lot of these things are going to help make a difference. And Marley, do you want to talk about that? And Marley says, yeah, I, you know, testified in front of the Senate, and we were trying to pass a bill or a law to mandate all TV 13, all TVs bigger than 13. And Senator McCain and Senator Harkin, I mean, who are huge advocates of the closed captioning. And from there, it did change. It did change the world for deaf people to be able to watch TV with closed captioning and not having to rely on interpreters for them to watch TV by themselves, or parents or brothers and sisters. They didn't have to rely on them. And Judy, I would not be sitting here if it weren't for you. You have made a huge difference in my world and for the deaf community and the disabled community, and even my kids as well. One of them is in education would have been around. She would not have had the resources that helped her with her education and her schooling. It made it much easier. And that's what she deserves. And so thank you, Judy, for you and for all of the noise that you've made over all these years. And I think that people think of disabled people and deaf people as being silent, and we're not silent. We do make a lot of noise, and we will continue to do so. And Alexis says, thank you so much, Judy, for being here. And thank you for all the work that you've done.
And I'm so happy to be with you two strong women. Yes, it's really great.
I love that you sign as well, Marley says. Love
it.
And Alexis is saying, I hope we can have you back to do more.
Yeah, and I'll have you on my program called The Human Perspective. We'll arrange that for the next month or so. And let me just show you my book, and then we can stop. So I've written this book with a woman named Kristen Joyner, Kristen. Here's the book. If you like to read, a lot of people like it. Oh, Marley's got it. Okay. Thank you very much, Women Power.
Thank you for that discussion. Thank you again. Marley says she loves you.